So, Konstantin, you were talking about your experiences actually in my part of the world, and if you would be kind enough to repeat for the audience your experiences in the glorious state of capitalism and how it treated both you as a journalist and people actually living there during Katrina, I think it would be super interesting to hear again.
I guess I need to apologize for my English. I didn't have many opportunities to practice. So if there will be pauses or some problems in our communication, I'd like to apologize for that in advance. As far as Texas goes, well, I had quite a career as a journalist, as a reporter. I spent roughly 4 years in the United States, and I visited some peculiar places in interesting times. We went to Katrina in 2000, to Louisiana in 2005 because of Katrina. Nobody actually expected it to be such a horrendous disaster, so we were completely unprepared. But we arrived we were one of the first international crews on the spot, and what I began to see immediately was how the system, which was considered the most powerful, the best in the world, the role model for everybody else, including Russia, was beginning to fall apart right before you, and that was completely incomprehensible, in my opinion. I couldn't understand how was it all possible. First of all, we went to New Orleans on our own, and there were no curfew at that time. And after negotiating with the police, we were allowed to sneak in. And what we saw on the ground, it appalled me. I saw people shocked and frightened, abandoned in the city. They told me that there were waves of evacuation, and that the white people and the rich people were evacuated first. Then there were many other waves, but the people of color, and what surprised me, the international students, some of them were Russians, we found them, were completely forgotten, and they had to make their own choices. The Russians, it's a separate story, because many Russian students who came to the US under a work and travel program, they were in complete and total romance with the United States and the atmosphere of entrepreneurship.
I was one right here, and I could not agree more. Yeah, please continue.
So they
I didn't have that phase because the Americans came to me.
Yeah, there you go. You either go to them or they come to you, and you get shell shocked. Yeah, please continue.
And then when you face up such an unexpected twist, and you see yourself forgotten and being unable to evacuate, having to wave flags from the top of the building and scream and shout and wait for the police to come and rescue you. That kind of changes your mind, but it didn't affect their state of mind immediately. Most of them decided that despite of all the sufferings and difficulties, they would like to stay in the United States and apply for permission to be there for a year or 2 years. But we saw it, and it was frightening. We saw bodies in trenches. We saw sick people who were left and with no help. We heard horrific messages on the local radio. It was not retransmitted by the big media, but people were talking about hundreds and thousands of casualties. To me, it was a very dramatic moment to realize. I wasn't a big fan of the United States, honestly. Prior to that, I traveled the world as a reporter. I covered numerous conflicts where the U.S. capital was involved. I wasn't yet even remotely a Marxist by then. I was rather like a victim of the Russian nationalistic propaganda, which I contributed a lot to. But nevertheless, I still was very impressed by the might and the scale of what the American state was. And when you see this state machine completely incapable of, helping its own people, it leaves an impression. The very same hurricane, Katrina, it approached New Orleans right after it went through Cuba. And the Cuban government managed to evacuate thousands of its citizens, and there was a coordinated effort to minimize the damage. So they did pretty well comparing. They offered all sorts of assistance they could, a tiny Cuba, to the U.S. government, and they were rejected, like many others, including Russia. So that was the moment to remember.
Yeah, that's the whole Katrina saga is just the perfect example of disaster capitalism that the U.S. takes advantage of, because for years, since I think 1998, activists were saying to officials that, hey, these levees are going to break, and when they break, the city is going to be destroyed. And of course, instead of having the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers fix the levees and, bolster the city's defenses, they were busy with oil and gas, thanks to Iraq. That was a more profitable endeavor for them to be sent to work on. But not only that, the wetlands outside of New Orleans were stripped, and wetlands work as a kind of natural buffer for storms. They slow them down and take some of the wind out of their sails, so to speak. But those wetlands were systematically destroyed because they weren't profitable, and instead, that same Corps of Engineers was used to cut a swath, a channel through that region of the wetlands to expedite shipping in the region. So there was like a double whammy there, that they went for profits and weakened the defenses of a very vulnerable city in two ways at the same time. So they laid the groundwork for what would have been just a fairly run-of-the-mill tropical storm, because it wasn't even a hurricane at that point when it made landfall on New Orleans. It was downgraded to a tropical storm.
Yeah.
But it completely destroyed the city. So what would have been we call natural disasters these horrific events, but they're only disasters if they are allowed to wreak havoc like they did in New Orleans. Like you said with Cuba, if there is competent leadership and a government that cares about its people, it doesn't have to be a disaster. It can just be a weather event. But the Katrina is just such a damning example of what the United States values and what it does not.
Yeah, absolutely. It took time for me to figure that the Russian government is actually no different in the way it treats its own population. I just don't want to sound like, somebody who came to the US to look for trouble and disasters to cover.
Especially for someone who's coming at that point from a country which turned into another country, and born in a state which no longer exists, which presumably from the Western perspective has crumbled because of its own inefficacies when it comes to how the state should be run and how the different Soviet republics should be organized, etc., etc. And then you go and visit the prime eye-opening, not even eye-opening, but just obliviously obvious, to call it that, example of the ideology that ended history on the other side, which presumably has defeated the backwards ideals of, in this case, the Soviets, and yet they cannot save their own people from a bunch of water, while right across a tiny speck of the ocean, a barely noticeable on the map island, manages to perform far better. All I'm saying is, this obviously wasn't the first time that you've seen massive events with your own eyes, etc., but it must have brought a sort of sense of dilemma in you between what is seen by all as the ideological victor of the Cold War versus what that ideological victor is actually capable of doing on the ground, which is borderline pathetic. So if this is the ideology that we should all strive towards, not ideology, but if this is the standard we should all strive for, then human potential is massively lost, to say the least.
Yeah.
Yeah, and in the recent Russian history, there are many local Katrina of the smaller size, with casualties, with extensive damage, which were ignored by the Russian government. Or, I could see America on every corner in Russia. The views and pictures that I documented in Camden, for example, New Jersey. It's very typical for the rural Russian, for provincial Russian regions.
What makes it more interesting is the fact that, again, this is not a defense of modern capitalist Russia, of course, but what makes it more interesting is that Russia as it currently exists is, of course, a semi-fractured nation who has been severely weakened in geopolitical standing and wealth and whatnot. Meanwhile, the United States has been the wealthiest country on earth for several decades, if not for over a century at this point.
It has no excuses.
Basically that's my point, is that even though the current Russian government is still a capitalist government, which frankly doesn't care, the American government is still somehow manages to be worse. And this is just basically comparing two rotten apples. But yeah, that's just a point to bring up.
Yeah, probably, but it's hard to say which bourgeoisie is more guilty. I think the modus operandi is universal. It takes some time for you to understand that. It took years for me to grasp it.
The best way to think about it is that the rope won't differentiate.
Hello everyone, and welcome to yet another episode of the Deprogram. Today we have something very special for you. Living up to the hype of being a truly international platform for leftists of most stripes, we are pleased to welcome Konstantin Viktorovich Syomin, an esteemed Russian journalist, blogger, former TV presenter, and the biggest openly Marxist content creator in that entire part of the world. When I told some of my Russian friends I am having you on, they fangirled like crazy, and to be honest, I am kind of fangirling right now a bit as well. But ignore me. The reason why this is such an important episode is because we were tired of listening to the loudest echo chamber in the world, Western political media, built up of obviously liberals, conservatives, and even leftists fighting over who can have a hotter take on the political climate in the entire post-Soviet world. So, what better way to get your information than straight from the horse's mouth? Or in this case, straight from the bear's mouth, a very, very red bear. Constantin is one of the most principled and most well-read Marxists I've had the pleasure of watching, so I invite our audience to truly listen to what he has to say. Welcome once again, Konstantin. Thank you for coming. Now, please feel free to tell our audience a bit about yourself before we jump into the first topic of the evening.
Well, thank you so much for such an introduction, which I obviously don't deserve. I tried to give you some biographical details about myself. I started working as a journalist at the age of 16. When I was 20, I was hired by the second biggest Russian national television station. Like all other stations, belonged and belongs to the state. I worked there for almost 20 years, being a reporter, a roving correspondent, an international correspondent. I also covered some affairs in the Kremlin. Then I was appointed to be the U.S. bureau chief. That's how it was called. And I spent 4 years in the United States in New York. So I traveled throughout the United States as well. When I got back to Moscow, I was hosting a nightly news show where I was allowed to comment events from a very subjective point of view. And probably that made my television career a little shorter than I expected. So in 2014, I was promoted. No, I was moved to a secondary television station, which also belongs to the state, Russia 24, like a 24 hours news channel. And I was doing some 5 minutes long pieces, commentary pieces for them, very personal to, but less damaging to the broadcaster. And I called them agitprop. I don't know if it has an exact translation into English.
It does.
It does. Okay. So it was a little provocative at first, and I think it was until the very last moment in 2019 when I was asked to leave, actually, and I didn't protest. I moved over to the internet where I was also present. And since then, since 2019, I only exist on YouTube, and I'm running a YouTube channel, Agitprop 2. That's what I am. That's how you know me, and I'm trying to educate myself, and I try to spread propaganda around me. That's who I am.
Beautiful, absolutely phenomenal. I encourage everyone to check out Konstantin's work. Absolutely everything that they do will be linked in the description, and we will give you extra details on where you can find Konstantin at the end of the episode. But already, if you want to check anything out, it's in the description below. Above whatever platform we're on, it's going to look different. So let's get it started, I guess. Konstantin, I'm going to be very direct. What's it like being someone in the communist camp in Russia right now? Recently, a colleague of yours of sorts, another what we would call Marxist content creator, got an unfriendly visit by the FSB. So I don't know, that must not be very fun. Tell us, is everyone on edge as much as we think they are?
I think it depends pretty much on how you define communism. If you are a member of the Russian Communist Party, an official organization which is explicitly supporting Putin and the Russian bourgeoisie, then you should be okay. You are going to be a part of big television shows. You are going to have public financing, and virtually you wouldn't have any difficulties in being a communist in that way. As far as you mentioned my friend Andrei Rudoy, who was forced to leave a couple of weeks ago because his apartment was raided by the FSB, is the local equivalent of FBI, if not everyone knows that. So somebody knocked on his door from the FSB, and they wanted to talk to him about an anti-war post on the internet by his former associates. He decided that it doesn't make sense to wait until they smash the door, and when they left at night, he also vanished. Does that mean that we are in grave and mortal danger already? I don't think so, but we are gradually approaching that situation. We are in the society which is developing into something way more fascistic than it used to be a couple of years ago. And with the contradictions between the Russian bourgeoisie and the rest of the world rising, I think the domestic pressure upon everybody who is calling himself communist is going to be on the rise as well. If you, the reason why we are not in trouble yet is probably because we are picking words very carefully. We are working on the phraseological side of propaganda, and we try our best not to become a target. But it doesn't mean that we are giving up the class essence of communist ideology, the propaganda that we have to distribute as communists. And still, I think that we are not in a grave danger like our comrades in Ukraine who are living in this state of outlaws and being hunted down. But I don't think that the distance between Ukraine and Russia is so great. We are closing the gap. That was my point for many years. I was trying to explain to my audience that, where there are any references to the Nazi regime and Nazi collaborators in Ukraine. Yes, they were and they are very visible. But when people are saying that from my side of the border, I want them to be truthful to themselves and look in the mirror and see what's happening here. And I was saying that Ukraine and Russia are still have very much in common in terms of what they are turning into after the dissolution of the USSR. Because the chemistry, the physics of the society of both countries are identical. We have the same oligarchs, we have the same capital that strives to protect its property. And for that, at one point or another, it's going to employ the brown skirts, the stormtroopers. They are already employed in Ukraine, and they, in my opinion, they will definitely, inevitably will be employed here.
Absolutely. I mean, Ukraine and Russia are basically two mirrors bouncing off of each other, which have directed themselves in slightly different directions after 1989 and have, let's call them, slightly different colors of the same sort of palette when it comes to the way that not only capitalism has developed, but that the top of the bourgeois core has ended up taking the power in both of the countries, and seeing both of them going to a direction that, to actually quote one of my favorite videos that you've made, is relatively similar to the one that Yugoslav nationalist conflicts did as a direct consequence of, the power vacuum, the left by basically not existing anymore. I mean, the similarities are eerie, and as someone from the Balkans, I can wholeheartedly tell you that. But that we know, the dissolution of the USSR would eventually lead to, national bourgeois interests pushing us all into conflict. But what would be interesting to hear, though, is your opinion on the, I guess, historic sequence of events before and, more importantly, after '89 that kind of got us here.
I am not an expert to give you the historic or socio-economic perspective here, but I will try to give you my understanding of it. I think that we cannot put the blame of dissolving the USSR on the late Soviet bureaucracy, or we cannot explain it through the lens of the Cold War. It was not obviously just the defeat or the victory by the imperialist forces of the West. It was something more complicated. And through the years, as you study it, and we have a vast network of Marxist circles here who are talking about that issue day and night, and we have discussions and forums, and you asked me how communists feel here. They are still able to do that. They're still able to communicate, to exchange some thoughts and ideas. But I think that who is a communist? It is someone who is fighting for the workers, and who is fighting against the dictatorship of capital. And if you're doing it sincerely and openly, you are going to get into trouble in the end. In that regard, we are still learning. We're still at the very beginning. The question that you asked me is a part of our theoretical experience now. We're talking about that. We're thinking about that. And one of the popular explanations, which I share to the dissolution of the Soviet Union, is that the revolution of 1917, like all processes in the material world, like any revolution, had to live through its beginning and through its culminating point, and then it started its essential and natural decline. That's why, because we had such a short period of time to cope with feudal prejudices and the remnants of the previous era, which in Russia lasted for hundreds of years. The revolution was just a short-living spark in time and universe to try to change Russia and to bring us to the new stage of development. But because it was a very short-living experience, and because the forces of the past were so powerful, when I'm talking about the forces of the past, I mean the previous modes of production. Like we had 90% of the population in 1917 involved in agricultural labor, and to transform such a vast mass of people into first workers, then enlightened workers, professional workers, unite them, and to overcome inevitable interracial, interethnic, interreligious contradictions that existed on such a big chunk of territory, 11 time zones. For that, we had...
And under constant sabotage by the rest of the world, let's not forget that.
Yes, we were in the class struggle with the forces of counter-revolution from around the world. Although we were supported by many countries and many progressive individuals from Europe and the United States and Latin America and Asia, still our ranks were not equal with the dominant powers of the world. And I think that one of the factors was the Second World War, which is called Great Patriotic War here, which it costed us millions of lives, and many of those lost lives were communists, people ideologically motivated and very much needed in order to fight for the cause of revolution in the future, and they were not there after 1945. But the most important argument, which I find absolutely appropriate, is that from 1950s there was a process of slow restoration of capitalism within the Soviet economy, and one of the most important parts of that restoration was the creation of big state monopolies, which had to compete with each other on the almost market basis. There were no market prices, there were no such categories as profit in the Soviet economy, but nevertheless the competition was there, and the remnants of capitalism, not to mention the remnants of feudalism, were slowly winning back territory,
being brought to the forefront.
Yeah. So this is how in 1970s we started talking about the peaceful coexistence with the capitalist system, and that was the beginning of the end of Russia-oriented socialist camp, because the Soviet bureaucracy, the nomenclatura, was not thinking about bringing the revolution forward, pushing it, and spreading the socialist transformation outside its borders. What mattered to them was their own self-sufficiency. They were acting like any other nationalist government. And many bright revolutionaries of the 20th century noticed that and wrote about it, like Fidel Castro and Che Guevara and many others who came to Moscow in the 50s, in the 60s, and later on they were very disappointed with the fact that there was an obvious national interest on the agenda for the Soviet elite. And once you make that turn, once you're looking for a deal with the capitalist environment that you have to exist in, you are more interested in fighting for what you have rather than what you want to and what you have to fight for. I think that was the beginning of the big decay and the events of 1989 and 1991 were the inevitable continuation of that logic.
But do you think that after all of these events, which have led to the unfortunate downfall of the Soviet dream, where, to quote you, actually, man is not only man's wolf, but something more. Do you think that it would have inevitably went to the events such as what is currently happening between Russia and Ukraine, what happened in Chechnya, etc., etc.? Are these the direct consequences of something which is relatively new in history, which is, the power vacuum left after the falling apart of a socialist experiment, or could have destiny, to be relatively silly here, could it have taken us into a different direction? Basically, I'm asking you was what we're seeing avoidable or not?
I don't think it was avoidable, at least not in the 80s. In the 80s, the process had gone too far. It was unstoppable. Once you have capital in the system, it will smash its way forward, and it did. So within the Soviet economy, there were tiny capitals, again, in each and every of its ethnic republics. The national conflicts were predetermined. They were unavoidable. And as a former citizen of Yugoslavia, do you know that the trajectory is the same?
Yeah.
That's
what I mentioned earlier.
It's not about Russians, it's not about Ukrainians, it's not about Chechens, it's not about Tajiks or Kyrgyz or any other nations. Because the very nature of national conflicts lies in the contradictions of capital.
I couldn't agree more, and I was kind of directing you towards the answer that maybe a lot of people in our audience, maybe not as much in our audience, but generally people who engage in realpolitik a bit too much a bit more than they're supposed to, thinking that there is a solution of international law or of a specific type of regulation which can lead to the elimination of interstate conflict through the development of, the liberal parliamentary democracy, etc., but it is inevitable to reach a point in which the capitalist class must look for a way to parasite the capitalist classes of its neighboring states and to excuse its own inadequacies through the pursuit of imperial and sometimes not even imperial war. But let's touch on something that's arguably going to be even more interesting, which is tell us, how are leftists aligning themselves in Russia regarding what's currently happening? Western comrades have mostly jumped on board on one team or another and have been, sticking to it as if it's a football match. What's the situation on the ground where you're at? Is there any consensus amongst the local left-wing organizations or not? I mean, you mentioned as long as you're pro what the state is conducting, you're good. If you are openly stating anything against it, you're not. But there must be a bit more gray in between that black and white. Am I wrong?
No, you're not. Well, to begin with, it was the official Communist Party of the Russian Federation who requested the government to send troops. And that's the starting point for the big divide that we're seeing here. And this is also why I said it's not easy to be a communist. You need to prove who you are, not by words, but by deeds. And we have a problem with that, obviously, but we are not alone in having such a problem. And to me, it reminds me of the situation at the beginning of the 20th century, prior to World War I. There wasn't a single communist party or socialist party in Europe who was not divided. And there were always, everywhere, the so-called socialists who chose to support its own bourgeoisie, its own government, and they found arguments to justify that. Usually they talk about the national liberation movement that they have to support, that they have to reach out to. And this is exactly what the so-called Russian communists, official communists, are saying today. They're talking about the interests of the discriminated people, Russian-speaking people of the Donbass, that couldn't be ignored. And that's why they're saying you need to be with your government, regardless of all the evil that the government represents and all the evil things that it is doing to the working class. At this moment, at this historical juncture, your government is, and the interests, the essential interests of your government, of your ruling class, of your bourgeoisie coincides with the interests of your workers, that they are saying. Like the Kautskys of the past, no difference. And but we have to remember that there are many Kautskys. They are not only located in Russia. And that's why I think your comparison with the football match are very relevant and very appropriate. We are not at a football game. This isn't a sport. Hundreds and thousands of people are dying every day. And what people don't understand, what people in the Western Hemisphere do not comprehend, I think, is that this is not a game between Ukraine and Russia. And this isn't a game between Russia and NATO and America, for example. This is the beginning, the early stage of the World War. It's not going to be confined within the Ukrainian or Russian borders. This is the beginning. This is the story which will affect each and every family in Poland and Hungary, in France and Spain or United Kingdom, the United States, Latin America, the Middle East, and certainly South Asia won't be just observers and outsiders to that process. This is the beginning. So I think that the most important thing today is to, and this is why I think our conversation today is very timely and is needed. The most important problem is how we can, if we can, rebuild the international solidarity between the working people, which was ruined, which was deconstructed after the fall of the USSR. And that solidarity movement is extremely necessary today. We are on the brink of some calamity, of horrific events, which we, I think, don't understand completely. We are not fully aware of the dangers that we are facing as a humanity, not as Russian communists or European leftists. And for that, the primary condition for rebuilding such understanding between the working classes of the world, the primary condition is the evidence that each and every socialist movement, each and every communist party or a tiny Marxist circle, each and every one of us are mostly focused on fighting our own domestic bourgeoisie. For example, I can tell you a lot of things about, Biden and US imperialism and the downsides of the evacuation process and the Hurricane Katrina. But this is not my number one priority. I have to be focused on what is happening in my courtyard. And only on such condition we can start talking frankly to each other and regain trust between the socialist movements of various countries. So if we get back to Russia, we have a tiny minority, a very small group of left-wing bloggers, Marxists. We don't have a party here, and it is frankly impossible to have it registered. There's no political process that you can take part in. But there's a bunch of individuals here who formulated their attitude to the war right after its start in February, who made everything they could to distance themselves from the official communists, who are seeing the tragedy, the catastrophe of the expanding military conflict as the beginning of the new international war, and who are, first of all, concerned and focused on the criticizing the role and on attracting the world's attention to the role of the Russian bourgeoisie in instigating this. And this is why I think that our work here, our propaganda here, our communicating efforts here are going to be more and more problematic in the future.
Absolutely. I mean, that's why the like doing stuff like this, as I introed the episode in general, and I hope Hakim and JT agree, is that absolutely nobody is really doing this. I mean, nobody's actually talking to one another, and even if they do, they're only looking for someone to confirm the things that they already previously think. And that is like a problem. I'm not only talking about CNN, BBC, and Fox and RT. These are people who consider themselves communists, but as you eloquently put, have maybe not actually earned to call themselves as such, but nevertheless they do. They refuse to engage with one another because in the so-called marketplace of ideas you get the grift going and growing if you stick to one particular crowd opinion and do not switch it at any point. And this is only exacerbated even more when it comes to opinions between Marxists of different nationalities, ethnicities, religions, and so on. So it's very difficult to sit at it's very difficult to even organize sitting at the table, let alone talking on one. But while we are not talking, the opposing force is, as cliche as it sounds, sure as hell is. So couldn't agree more. But I just wanted to comment on the because I honestly, personally, subjectively feel like it might be taking it a bit to the next step, even though it potentially still could happen. Why do you believe that the current events which are transpiring between the Russian Federation and Ukraine are so vastly different to many large-scale conflicts that we've, for example, even seen in the Cold War, but which have not led to a world war, or events since the 90s in general, mass-scale warfare, obviously not to the same extent as the one between Russian Federation and Ukraine. Why do you think that this particular case could lead to a much wider, much more internationalist conflict than what we've seen before? Basically, that's what I'm asking.
I think that as Marxists, we have to look for fundamental materialistic reasons behind any conflict, right? And we cannot say that what's happening is happening because of one individual, be it Putin or anybody else.
Of course.
So what causes wars in general is there should be a contradiction, right? Or a bunch of contradiction, or a mountain of contradictions. And we are having that mountain of contradiction right before our eyes. The fundamental reason for the new imperialist war is the global capitalist crisis, which actually it didn't stop in 2009. It is still going on, but the next phase of it is going to be mortally dangerous for the capitalist elites everywhere, in the US, in China, in Russia, or elsewhere. So, as we know from the past, such contradictions, the capitalist systems know only one way to resolve them, and it is either a major crisis, financial downturn, and they usually go together, it is a major war. And what's going on between Ukraine and Russia is not related to Russia and Ukraine. It is not a conflict of Putin and Zelensky. It is not a battle of Putin and the so-called West. It is the logical continuation of the... What is war? War is a competition through other means. And we are seeing the two giant centers of capital which are competing for primacy, the domination on the global markets. And Russia versus Ukraine is just one of the front lines of this future.
Where that conflict is fought.
And yeah, exactly. It is not the only one. Surely not. If you take a look back at how the First World War began, you would see the very same picture. Smaller conflicts in various parts of the world where the big countries were competing, from South Africa to the Balkans, in 1910, in 1912, in 1913, in Asia, in Africa, everywhere. Then, when it turns out that the contradictions are irresolvable, a tiny provocation starts the major war. So this is exactly, I think the parallels are indisputable. They are very visible, and I haven't yet met anybody who would be able to give me a solid enough counter-argument. So Ukraine and Russia are just a small part of this future front line. Where else it could be continued, Taiwan is on everybody's mind. It will also be joined by the Middle East, South Caucasus, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Iran, Turkey versus Greece, and I don't even mention Latin America, where you have many conflicts in their development. So I'm pretty sure that it has such a global perspective, and we have to look at this conflict not through the subjective
lenses of just a local one,
personal lens. Yeah, because many liberals here and in the West, as far as I heard, they are seeing it as a problem of one adventurous murderous politician who should be removed, and then it all calms down and the situation gets back to normal. It won't. It's not about Putin or Zelensky or Biden or Xi Jinping. It is about capitalism, and capitalism resolves its contradictions through wars.
Nothing to add, to be perfectly honest, except I hope that the contradictions have not piled up so much that there is no manner through which the working class can potentially start to resolve them before they reach a point of so much calamity that they would engulf the whole world in fire. But that are only the hopes of little old me. The dialectic will tell us the future of our species from this moment on, I guess. But let's make it. We went very, very broad, which is extremely interesting. But let's talk about something extremely specific, such as, for example, the killing of Alexandra Dugina. It massively restarted the conversation on Dugin all over the world. And the right-wing figure had been constantly defined by, Western media as some sort of ideological genius behind Putin. But whenever I would mention this to any of my Russian friends, the response would be rolling laughter and dismissal. So, is there anything to this story, or is it just sensationalism? And if not, I know we're trying to simplify it, but still, I think it's interesting to debunk, even if it's not true. So, if not, are there any quote unquote ideological leaders behind the Russian government or the Ukrainian one, for that matter, or not?
If you asked me that question half a year ago, I think I would probably laugh too. It is a laughable figure, a laughable person, and it is not widely popular, and nobody was taking Dugin seriously up until recently. But then, for example, today, just a couple of hours ago, he had a meeting with Alexander Lukashenko, the president of Belarus.
Oh, wow.
And that made me ask if Dugin is allowed to such corridors of power. Where else is he treated as a big philosopher? And how influential is he in reality?
Oh, you just fucked me. Oh my.
And that
really,
puzzles,
with Lukashenko?
Yeah. Google it.
Fuck. Yeah, I believe you.
And that puzzles me, and not only me. And if you match that fact with some of the wording Putin chose in his recent speech, talking about the satanic influences of the Anglo-Saxon West.
Anglo-Saxon race.
Yeah.
Okay. I was like, you know that meme where Leonardo DiCaprio from, what was that movie? Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. He's like pointing at the screen, and I was like, there, he said it. Was when Putin was referring to, I did that exact meme. All of my friends in the room were like, what the fuck are you doing? It was absolutely classless. Sorry, please continue.
So we've been thinking that it was a joke, that it was an anecdote, and it couldn't be true. I think 7 years ago, I had a chance to talk for an hour with Dugin. I didn't know who he was, and he was a host or even a chief editor at one of the most right-wing television stations here, the Tsargrad.
Oh my God, Tsargrad! It's called Tsargrad.
You know, yeah.
I love it.
It is owned
by
one of the Russian oligarchs, Orthodox oligarchs, very religious, but frankly, just
the ones that buy churches all the time, buy their way
oligarchs.
into heaven.
Yeah,
gotta fucking love
Konstantin
them.
Malafeev, he's the owner, and Dugin there was occupying the post of the chief editor. So he invited me while I was working on for the state television, and I started my show, Agitprop, there in red and black colors. It was the intro was drawn in such colors, and they, for some reason, I didn't know. I was guessing why was I of any interest to Dugin, but then I realized that red and black is the typical gamma for all the right-wingers everywhere. So they probably thought that they have something to talk to me about, and they invited me, and I talked to Dugin for an hour. And this was when he...
Wait, they thought that you were kind of like sending like smart signals to all your right-wing brothers all over the world. Like,
listen,
look, I do the black and red thing.
Like all fascists everywhere today, they are not openly talking about fascism. They are talking about justice. They're talking about oligarchy that is robbing the people, and you need to get rid of the internationalist oligarchs who are sucking Russian blood out. So they are very actively exploiting the socialist phraseology, as they did in Germany in 1930s.
Always.
And they are doing that. It always.
You can never find
everywhere.
Originality in a fascist.
Yes,
Never.
they are doing that in Turkey. That's why Dugin has friends there. They're doing that in Hungary. They are doing it in the United States of America. It's all the same. Maybe there in the US, they are more like pro-market, pro-liberal, in terms of the economy. But here, they like to play with one very important aspect that we probably did not plan to touch upon, is the exploitation of the post-Soviet nostalgia within the masses. And because many people have zero knowledge of what socialism is or was, but they are remembering that this was a more or less just society. It didn't have such... the gap between the poor and the rich wasn't that wide as it is today, and they are very nostalgic towards the USSR, and this nostalgia is being exploited by people like Dugin and others, and with that they are mixing the post-Soviet nostalgia with nationalism and the feelings of revanchism. They're building something, some new spirit out of that, and in its core, that spirit is purely fascistic. So I spoke with Dugin for an hour, and to me it was a revelation, because he was very open. He didn't hide what his views are, and he said such strikingly crazy things about communism and socialism and the USSR that it really really shocked me right there. Since then, I cut all communications with the people who invited me to Tsargrad and tried to forget about them. But I thought that he's just...
Sorry for your trauma, my friend.
playing crazy. And then
he's batshit.
you see him meeting Lukashenko today. and then you're seeing his and there are a couple of the Telegram is a popular substitution for all other social media
we all
here.
use it, yeah.
So we all are on Telegram, and he is frequently quoted by the pro-government, like official Telegram channels. It's like a pure idiocy. I cannot even.
When the 3 next days after his daughter was murdered, after he was supposed to be assassinated, absolutely every single war news Telegram that I follow had so many videos of right-leaning Russian soldiers, I guess, like for example, firing rockets and saying "Za Duginu" or "This is for Dugin," etc. It was like on one front, I have like my Russian friends telling him, "Man, this guy's a meme. This is like deep internet shit. This is like niche, funny beard guy says stupid shit like, oh, the fourth column, like, oh, conservatism is the new progressivism, like meme guy." But then you see like guys on the front read this dude, like. I'm sorry, and now he's meeting with Lukashenko. I'm not trying to be non-academic and connect A to B to Z, pun intended.
And then Putin refers to him as one of they attack our philosophers, he says.
Yeah, and then you start saying, "Oh my God, maybe there's something to this, right?"
So this is I think it is very dangerous. It's like finding out that somebody who's piloting your plane is a lunatic and you cannot do anything with it, and he's like absolutely determined to smash your plane into the wall. And this is the state of mind that we are in. Very, very frightening. And I had a chance to talk to Daria also, I need to mention. That was also in 2015. I think it is a very tragic thing that happened. But, I was invited to a conference of the left-winging publicists and bloggers in the Balkans, actually. It was in Greece in 2015. They said, I didn't even realize that the organizers were in a way related to Dugin and his organizations. And they said, like, there will be socialists from Switzerland, from Germany, and we need to hear your perspective on various problems. So I agreed. We went there, and there I met Daria, and we talked. And what shocked me and surprised me was how often they used the term war. They were talking about the war constantly, about how inevitable the war is, and how we as a society need the war to get rid of all the rot and all the
rebirth through fire.
Exactly. That is
classic.
Motto.
Another classic.
They've been talking about that, and she seemed to me. How old was she? 22, I think. I thought, who made that to you? I was very surprised to hear such things from such a young girl, and I didn't know that her last name was Dugina, because she introduced herself as Daria Platonova. But I think that she eventually became another victim of her father's crazy ideologies, and now I'm very worried that there will be more, that the numbers will be counted in not in thousands, but maybe in millions. Yeah. So
we always at this podcast we always try to spin it to a bit of a joke, almost everything, no matter how serious it is, and we sometimes have to apologize because we overdo it. But respectfully, if this world goes into a massive world conflict based on such an idiotic ideology as what Dugin proposes, maybe and respectfully, we deserve to be burned the fuck to the ground, because that, I said my piece.
One thing I'd like to add is, though, that you shouldn't forget about your own Dugins. You have plenty of
course.
them.
Oh,
in
we have
Europe,
plenty.
and he has very positive relations with.
But I thought you guys were better.
His alter egos in the
left.
like,
the leftovers of class consciousness in the post-Soviet world were supposed to stop the development of such reactionary degenerates.
It surprises me that some people still think that what's left of the USSR could become the platform for rebuilding of socialism, that we are somehow responsible for socialism, for what socialism is or will be tomorrow.
It's a meme.
No, but what I wanted to stress out is that he had good relations, and he has good relations with his American counterparts, and some of them took part in creating Tsargrad. I even met some of the producers associated with the Fox network in their studio. So we need to look carefully after the Dugins of the West. In the US, they are hoping to win a major victory in November, and there's no lack of crazy people elsewhere, so we are not alone. And it would be very disappointing to learn that.
Yeah, say the least. If this
the world is run
everywhere.
by craziness, not just us are its the hostages of his lunacy.
But then again, when we think about, for example, when we talk about World War II and World War I, just follow me with this. World War II in particular, like we look at Nazism, National Socialism, the NSDAP, and it genuinely looks absolutely bafflingly insane to us. So maybe if there's anything left in 200 years and they look back at why we fought our wars today, which again, I hope it doesn't come to that, they will, to the same extent as we look back at us and say, okay, none of this makes fucking sense. What the goddamn hell are you people doing? But to a particular subset of people lost in time and space because of the way the system is pushing them towards right-wing extremism is set up. To them, I guess it makes sense. But like speaking about insanity, particularly, not insanity. Speaking about ideological direction, what about? Teach us about Putin and his party in particular. We know that wars are not led by individual men or their ideas. They are, as we said multiple times during this episode, led by different types of contradictions which are created by the inadequacies of the system. But still, let's follow through. What would you say their like long-term goals are from obviously a Marxist perspective? Are they like simple neoconservative opportunists willing to do anything to preserve long-term political power, or real so-called patriots looking out for Russia? Same back, just so we don't throw everything just in Russia. Same with Zelensky and his folk over in Ukraine. What do you think drives them?
I think that we shouldn't explain everything through the lens of personal craziness. Again, sorry to repeat that. And
it's very important.
I also forgot to mention that all fascists are needed when capital feels endangered by the crisis and he's scared of the workers' potential unrest. It needs to subjugate labor. That's when it becomes a limelight moment for the Dugins and the like. And this is exactly what's happening. Very unfortunate it is for us that the working class is sleeping. Its class conscience is sleeping, and it does not realize its own natural interests. This is why the poor people, the working people, are going to be thrown into this bloodbath first, because the rich are not going to risk their lives and not going to die. But getting back to what you asked me, how I see the primitive logic of this conflict, I think that there were lengthy negotiations between Putin and his clique and the new Biden administration. As you remember, it was relatively okay with Trump because Trump was more focused on China and he was hoping to bring Putin on his side. So the choice was either you sit quiet and look at the US-Chinese competition from a side, or we will destroy you. And I think that was the beginning of the Putin-Biden dialogue. It didn't go well. So when Biden evacuated from Afghanistan, it obviously was already on his mind that something was about to happen in Ukraine. I think the offer was, if you don't comply, we will break the Minsk agreements. You remember that was the
yeah. Standstill
the only
sort of
the only reason why the war in the Donbass stopped. They signed a sort of a deal, and I think that Putin and his peers, they felt so enthusiastic about the military potential of Russia. They were, I think that they were filled up with their own propaganda. They are some people say here that they are watching the TV they are paying for, and the television. The television had been telling for years that we won the war in Syria. We dealt a major blow to the U.S. imperialism there, and we have a top-notch army which is capable of, beating the shit out of NATO and everybody else. So that was the set of mind in February when Biden said, okay, there's no Minsk, and Putin said, I'm fantasizing. I have zero confidence in my version of events, but I think I'm pretty close.
No, please do.
And Putin said, okay, then there's no Ukraine. And then he was getting himself prepared for that. Last summer, he published a lengthy article addressing himself to Ukrainians, where he described Ukraine as an anti-Russia. And he said then that Russia won't ever be able to tolerate such anti-Russia on its borders. So there were many other...
But okay, sorry, I have to interrupt you. So the reason he wrote the article, the reason that all the events have transpired from the perspective of Putin's party, is it to reestablish themselves on the throne of Russian parliamentary politics? Or do you think it's the need to leave a legacy behind, to actually serve the interests of Russia, or like 500 other potential reasons?
I think many reasons played out.
Many reasons.
He was obviously, he'd been talking so many times about the greatest tragedy of the 20th century, which was the collapse of the USSR. And he, as a former KGB officer whose direct responsibility was to not to let it happen, I think he was living with this thought for years. It was his personal desire to leave a trace in history as someone who eventually restored the damaged national dignity of Russia. And he's equaling Russia, the Tsarist Russia and the contemporary Russia, to the USSR. He sees no difference. For him, It is one and the same. So I think that was one of the motives. But most importantly, he was thinking about gaining access for the Russian monopolistic capital to some new markets and resources. He was thinking about, and he just recently he acknowledged it publicly, that he wanted to restore water supply for the Crimeans, because the water was cut out. It was a very, very painful issue for the Putin government and for Crimea. So there were many, more than one, obviously, materialistic reasons that dictated his logic and eventual decision to strike first. But primarily, I think that if he had to make this decision today, knowing what he knows already, he wouldn't ever do that again. But he was thinking, it was a grave miscalculation on his side, definitely, but it was a very well constructed miscalculation.
But that is super interesting coming from you, because it tends to be a common point among even comrades in the West and in the rest of the world, but not only them, but liberals and conservatives as well, that it can't possibly be that simple. Like, it cannot possibly just be a miscalculation. I mean, come on.
It is everything. It is definitely a miscalculation. Otherwise, it wouldn't be such a disaster. And it is a disaster.
But what about trusting the plan? Maybe they're playing 4D chess. I'm joking.
I think
I'm pretending to be the usual typical Western Twitteroid idiot that would
I understand.
argue you in
maybe
in
I'm
the
not
same
adding
manner.
enough humor to your podcast, but
knowing
that this week, like a day ago, 15 people died in one of the rural towns,
training
on the Russian territory, and people are dying every day in Ukraine, and they are not even mentioned in the Russian news. I cannot be very humorous, unfortunately.
Of course.
So I think that there was everything. There was definitely a personal miscalculation, which is a representation of how rotten and outdated and anti-progressive the current political regime is. This is not the major reason, but one of the important particular details we have to keep in mind. Yes.
It's definitely a factor, absolutely.
So it was obviously, and for sure, I'm not saying that it is just Putin who was guided into this trap, although he was guided into this trap, and the trap was well prepared. It was prepared by NATO and for years. It was no question. It was a game between the bigger imperialist and the small predator. But despite all that, was there a personal moment and the personal involvement and personal decision? I think surely it was. So he was thinking that because the
that's clear.
The Americans are on retreat. He's given a chance to grab a vast chunk of territory, to solve many questions of the local importance, one of them being the transit of power in 2024. And if you say it is a version, but I think it's a very truthful one, if you reunite the former Soviet republics like Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia into something, into the newer Russia, which would remind to millions of the USSR, he would go to history as somebody to be respected, and I think he wanted such respect.
We like to usually finish on a positive note, or at least not a positive, at least optimistic, even though in times like this, especially for your part of the world, there's very little sun to come through the clouds. But before I go to the concluding question, I believe Hakim had an inquiry towards you that might not be completely in line with everything that we touched now. That is very like current moment stuff, but it would still be extremely interesting to hear your view on. So Hakim, please.
Yes, it's a very quick question actually, but a pet interest of mine, I guess you can call it, is economic planning and all the current research that goes into it. And I'm aware of plenty of research in the Russian sphere on this sort of stuff. A lot of it's not usually, like, it's not state supported. These are usually independent PhDs or grad students who do this sort of work. But I was wondering, do you know of anything that's going on in that sphere? Basically the developments within the Russian economic planning sphere, despite the fact that it doesn't take place within the Russian state, but you understand what I mean.
Oh yeah, there are a number of people who are working in that direction. A friend of mine, Alexei Safronov, who is an economist with some of the governmental institutions, and he's not alone. There's a YouTube channel, Simple Numbers, Простые числа in Russia. In Russian, they are more inclined to view the world through Wallerstein's lens, but nevertheless, they are writing and talking very often about the aspects of economic planning and how it is, how it has to be, how it could be, how it was in the Soviet Union. So there are many. What's good about the state of communist movement in today's Russia is that there are many people who are experiencing themselves, or is that the way to say it? Who are finding interest in theory, and they are writing papers. They are taking part in discussions, and economic planning is one of the most important aspect of this work. So if you are willing to find contacts in this academic sphere, academic circles, I may try to find appropriate people for you and get you in touch.
Please do. I would highly appreciate it.
Phenomenal. So the lightly positive touch point that we wanted to finish on, I guess, is the Bolsheviks came to power when Russia was in a drawn-out war during World War I. Do you see any possibility for political radicalization by the conflict to inspire the young and old in looking at the left once more as their savior? Could this be used to grow the movement, or has it already been hijacked, is what I'm basically asking. Or will this just push the country further right, the way we've seen in many post-socialist experiments?
I'm worried about nuclear weapons. You wanted me to say something funny.
No, not funny, my friend. I asked you.
Take them aside and look at what's going on here and there and in the Balkans and everywhere. I think that the radicalization you are talking about is inevitable, but it has to come at a price. And that price might be very high. And it was high in the past.
Paying. Oh,
you mentioned Bolsheviks, but
okay, now it was funny. Now your joke ended up being funny. Okay.
But it depends on what is high and what the price is. You mentioned Bolsheviks, but nobody knew Bolsheviks in 1917. Their ranks were like 8,000 members of the whole party, and they were not running the show even in spring of 1917. So the radicalization of masses is brought by suffering and war and crisis and unemployment. And these are not the events that we are actually hoping to see. We are not going to applaud them. But we understand that as Marxists, that class conscience only... people wake up only when there's something happening to them. If what they're concerned about today is how to conserve, how to save their current way of life, how to make things as they used to be. People who are going to be freezing in Europe, they're only concerned about how to actually rewind to the previous state of world affairs and the economy, and they are not seeing the power shortages or the military conflicts they are dragged into as a consequence of the capitalist collapse, of the capitalist crisis. They will start asking questions. They will be getting answers. And this is going to be a very decisive and important moment, because the socialists and the communists are not the ones who are going to be giving answers to them. Our right-wing competitors will be offering their own very simple solutions, and they will be winning over their hearts and minds, the hearts and minds of the ordinary people, of the working people. They will be pointing fingers at the conspirators, at the evil nations who caused the trouble, the Russians, the Ukrainians, the Poles, the Jews. Everybody will be guilty. But I think that, like Lenin said once, there wouldn't be a Russian Revolution without the World War I. The exact saying might be different, but the meaning is that. So I think that we will see the major awakening of the people on all continents. And what I'm very worried about is that we're not ready for that moment. And to be ready for that, we need to rebuild the international solidarity of the socialist organizations. And for that, every one of us has to be concerned primarily about its own number one enemy, its local bourgeoisie, its local oligarchy. And that's what we're trying to do here. And I hope that this concept is equally shared by everyone on that podcast today.
For sure. This was a great interview, absolutely. It's always interesting to get the perspective, especially from post-socialist countries, because there is a real experience of socialism there and the consequences of the restoration of capitalism that show themselves differently than, for example, in many cases, like my own case, in a semi-colonial, formerly feudal country and whatnot. But really, we do appreciate your time. We appreciate that you took time out of your very busy schedule to come and talk to a bunch of idiots on the internet. But I was going to ask you, do you have any projects that you're currently working on? If it's anything that you want to keep, under wraps, then of course keep it under wraps. But organization-wise or anything else within Russia currently?
It's hard to plan anything today, given the mobilization that has started, and we're living through a manhunt on the streets. It is also a challenge for every one of us, because one thing is to, be anti-war and, critical of the government, and another one is to make a decision. Either you're going to the battlefront, or you're hiding, or you're trying to escape the country, and then do what? So it's challenging to plan anything today. But we are thinking, and we're planning nevertheless, where we would like to be part of the rejuvenated socialist movement in the future Russia. We are stretching our hands to all comrades in the former Soviet socialist republics, and in other countries like your countries. I cannot go any further, and I'm trying to be very accurate in my wording today.
And you've done a great job. No, you've done a great job.
For obvious reasons. But yes, we have some ideas, and we are working on them. We would like to give a new impulse to socialist propaganda here, but we are yet a little undecided as of where and how it could be perceived, and how can we do it, how we can do it better. So I won't go into further details, but yes, we're not going to sit silent and watch from a side.
Which we thank you for. Just please stay safe and be careful. And you have so much experience throughout your life that I'm sure you will utilize it properly for Agitprop 1, Agitprop 2, Agitprop 77, and as many Agitprops that might be necessary in the future. Thank you for coming on the show. Everyone listening, you will be able to find all the resources of all the work that Konstantin is putting out into the world. Konstantin, if you would like to tell our dear listeners about where they could find you online, any last closing messages, and we'll bring this long but I believe very informative episode to a close.
You can easily find me on YouTube, but unfortunately it is still only in Russian. Maybe in the future we'll be able to come up with some foreign language versions of the same propaganda stuff.
We have a decent number of Russian-speaking listeners as well, from not only Russia but the Russian-speaking world.
I still think that we should add more languages to our spectrum of propaganda tools. One thing I forgot to say is that you asked what do we do, what we would like to do. We are trying to give stage and a possibility to speak out to our fellow-minded viewers from other republics, and sometimes from places that are already drowning in wars. We did an interesting interview with a colleague and friend from Armenia, and now I recorded another one with guys from Azerbaijan, and I think it is a very, very promising strategy. I'm hoping that one day we'll be able to have friends and comrades from Ukraine speaking openly. Unfortunately, it isn't possible today, but that's what we want to do. And this is why I also would like to invite all of you, and I'm a big fan of Second Thought. Some of the videos were translated and are giving crazily wide circulation here among Marxists. So it is really an honor for me to be interviewed by you, but I would also like to do vice versa and have you as my guests and ask you questions about life in the US and propaganda in the US and being a socialist in the US or in Iraq or in Yugoslavia or whatever. So again, I'm very thankful for this opportunity. I apologize for not being the best speaker, but
Your English is better than ours.
good.
Shut up. It is perfect.
You did excellently. Thank you.
Well, this has been a fantastic episode, if I do say so myself. Thank you so much for coming on. I personally learned a lot. I think our listeners will as well. So thank you one more time for coming on. This has been the Deprogram. I'm JT.
I'm Hakeem.
I'm Yugopnik.
I'm Konstantin. Workers of the world unite.
Bye-bye.